1995, the delicious gumball at the center of this Japanese 1990s lollipop. And this particular lollipop is bittersweet in the most literal sense of the word. Sports triumph and human tragedy, groundbreaking technology and unsolved mysteries, continued pop dominance, and a watershed moment in Japanese hip-hop. 1995 in Japan has all of that, and so much more. So why don't you stick around for a while and indulge in some much-needed nostalgia? My name is Aniki, and you're watching Timeline Japan 1990s. Now, we sure do a lot of rewinding the clock around here, but what about fast-forwarding it? Well, if you head on over to this link right here, you could be watching all my videos a day early and skipping those cursed ads entirely. And all of that starting at just $1 a month.
100 yen.
100 yen.
The magic of Patreon. Liking and subscribing are as always hugely appreciated as well, so go ahead and do your thing. My thing though, taking you back to the past. So allow me to present Japan in 1995. IKIMASHOU! Let's do this. January of 1995 belongs entirely to Japan's Kansai region, starting on the 9th when baseball player Nomo Hideo announced that he was leaving Japan to play in American Major League Baseball. The way he pulled it off was, to put it mildly, pretty creative. At the time, Nomo was in his 5th season as a pitcher for the Osaka-based Kintetsu Buffaloes. A serious talent with stats to match, an unorthodox delivery style that had earned him the nickname Tornado, and frankly, one of the biggest profiles in Japanese baseball at the time. But behind the scenes, things had soured. The Buffaloes, who held all the leverage as the team that had drafted him, refused to meet his contract demands. Nomo, for his part, was done with the Buffaloes. Fortunately for him, his agent Don Nomura had found a way out, and a genuinely ingenious one at that. You see, the voluntary retirement clause in the Japanese uniform players contract stated that any player who retired from the sport would have to return to their former team if they ever came back to baseball. To Japanese baseball, that is, because American baseball was an entirely different jurisdiction. And so, Nomo Hideo officially quote-unquote retired from Nippon professional baseball in December of 1994, and on January 9th, 1995, announced his intention to sign with an American team, neatly bypassing his contract obligations in their entirety. And just a few weeks later, he had become a Los Angeles Dodger. The reaction in Japan was not warm. The relationship between Nomo and the Buffaloes had already been strained as is, and engineering his exit through a legal loophole was the final straw for many. The Japanese sports press called him a traitor, selfish, greedy. In a space of just 2 months, one of the country's most popular athletes had become one of its most controversial. Some went even further, predicting he simply wouldn't cut it in the MLB. But as it turned out, he absolutely did. Named an MLB All-Star in his very first season, Nomo then went on to spend 13 successful years in America across 8 different teams. But perhaps more importantly, he is only the 2nd Japanese player in history to make the jump to MLB. His move blew the door wide open for others to follow. So whatever you think of the method, the outcome benefited Japanese baseball players for decades to come, showing that sometimes, just sometimes, a loophole can actually be a good thing. A natural disaster, however, is never a good thing. 8 days later, on January 17th, the Kansai region was struck by the worst earthquake it had seen in the entire 20th century. The Great Hanshin earthquake. At 5:46 AM local time, a magnitude 6.9 quake hit the region, affecting among many others Osaka, Kyoto, and Kobe, and lasting approximately 20 seconds. 20 seconds that proved utterly catastrophic, both in terms of financial damage and human life. The most striking image of the disaster, columns of the Hanshin Expressway knocked over like a row of dominoes, became one of the defining photographs of the decade. But actually, that was only a sample of what had happened. More than 400,000 buildings were damaged. Total losses amounted to an estimated $422 billion in today's money. Hundreds of thousands of residents were left homeless, around 40,000 were injured, and somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people lost their lives. Kobe alone, as the major city closest to the epicenter, lost around 4,600 people that morning. The deadliest earthquake in Japan since the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, and one of the most devastating natural disasters in modern Japanese history. Rebuilding was always going to be a monumental undertaking, but disaster was followed by something remarkable. The entire country came together. Over 1.2 million volunteers descended on the region from across Japan, ordinary citizens, international helpers, and in one of the more unexpected footnotes of the disaster, the Yakuza. Organized crime groups, primarily the Kobe-based Yamaguchi-gumi, played a genuine role in the immediate aftermath by distributing aid to residents when official emergency response was slow to arrive. Was it largely an image exercise at a time when organized crime was under mounting pressure? Absolutely, but it was real tangible help when it was needed most nonetheless, followed by the far greater efforts of the hundreds of thousands of people who showed up simply because someone needed help. That, more than anything else, is how the Great Hanshin earthquake is remembered 30 years on. As a moment of immense loss and destruction, yes, but also as a moment when Japan showed what it was made of. January 17th was subsequently declared National Disaster Prevention and Volunteerism Day, and the earthquake fundamentally reshaped Japan's approach to disaster preparedness for decades to come. After a disaster of that magnitude, Japan really needed something uplifting. What better way to lift the national mood than some genuinely great 90s hip-hop? February 1995 belonged entirely to fat beats and sharp rhymes, as rap group EastEndxYuri made sure the entire country of Japan knew exactly what hip-hop was and what it could do. Two extraordinary things happened for the genre that month. First, the group's debut single Dayone, released the previous summer, finally reached critical mass, climbing to number 7 on the Oricon singles charts and holding that position for 3 consecutive weeks. Dayone had been a slow burn actually, quietly gaining traction in Hokkaido of all places before suddenly exploding across the entire rest of the country. And honestly, why wouldn't it? It was catchy, it was infectious, it was fun, it was hip-hop. By early 1995, it had become a full-blown phenomenon, spawning multiple versions in different regional Japanese dialects, and most significantly, becoming the very first Japanese-produced hip-hop track ever to sell over 1 million copies, a milestone usually reserved for only the most established names in mainstream Japanese music. The crazy part, EastEndxYuri weren't done. Not even close. The very same month that Dayone was sitting in the top 10, the group then dropped a follow-up single called Maika, which debuted on February 13th at number 3. 2 tracks in the Japanese top 10 simultaneously, both on their way to 1 million copies sold. Now that is how you make an entrance. The impact of EastEndxYuri's breakthrough that February was genuinely significant for the genre of hip-hop in Japan. Most Japanese people had certainly heard of hip-hop in 1995, but now someone was making it locally, doing it brilliantly, and finding mainstream success with it. Dayone, Maika, and tracks from other influential Japanese rap artists like Shadara Par's 1994 single Konya wa Boogie Back collectively brought what is a deeply American genre into Japanese homes, classrooms, and parties. From that moment on, hip-hop never really left, and Japan had claimed it as one of its own. And you know what? The country of Japan had even more to be hyped up about the following month. Because on March 10th, Japanese electronics giant Casio delivered one of the most forward-thinking cameras ever made. The QV10 digital camera. This thing looks fairly unremarkable at first glance, right? A lens, a slightly chunky silver body, no fat shaming intended, and a small screen on the back. Well, my friends, may I remind you that this is the year of our Lord 1995 we're talking about here. Take another look at that screen, because what you're looking at here is the first LCD viewfinder ever used in a consumer digital camera. Now, for the youngins among you who grew up never touching a camera without one, let me paint you a picture of what photography was like before it. Guesswork. In some cases, pure guesswork even. You point it, you shot, and you hope for the best, finding out what you'd actually captured only after the fact. The Casio QV10, however, ended that entirely. With its glorious 1.8-inch TFT panel, you could immediately see whether your photo looked great or completely sucked, and do something about it on the spot. But hey, that gorgeous LCD screen wasn't the only trick up its sleeve. The lens rotated a full 180 degrees, perfect for those beautifully crunchy 320x240 mid-90s selfies, and images could be transferred directly to a computer from its 2MB flash memory, which stored up to 96 shots at a time. Yes, to a computer. The future is now, old man. And to bring the price down to an extremely accessible 65,000 yen, or roughly $400 in today's money, Casio had to make some sacrifices, and image quality was the main one. The QV10 wasn't the sharpest shooter on the market, even by 1995 digital camera standards. Digital cameras were still significantly behind analog in sheer image quality as it was. But for convenience, for the actual experience of taking photos, this thing was operating years ahead of its time. Japanese tech was still very much running laps around everyone else deep into the 1990s, and the Casio QV10 is all the proof you need.
Game of the Year.
March 20th, yet another date in 1995 that shook the entire nation. This time, though, with no earthquake required at all. At 7 AM that morning, during Tokyo's peak rush hour, members of Japanese doomsday cult Omu Shinrikyo released a nerve agent Sarin on 3 different lines of the Tokyo subway system. 14 people were killed, 50 were severely injured, nearly 1,000 more suffered temporary vision damage and other acute symptoms. It was the most serious attack on Japanese soil since the end of World War II, and it was also heartbreakingly not entirely without precedent. Just 9 months earlier, a sarin attack in the residential city of Matsumoto had claimed 8 lives and injured over 500. Same nerve agent, same culprits. But at the time, investigators had found no conclusive evidence pointing directly at Omu Shinrikyo and its leader Asahara Shoko. But the Tokyo subway attack of 1995 changed that permanently. The cult's motivation, as it turned out, was chilling in its logic. Omu Shinrikyo had learned that a police raid on their premises was planned for 2 days later, and chose the subway lines passing through Kazumikazeki and Nagatacho, home of the Japanese parliament, as their target, in a bid to somehow destabilize the operation before it could happen. But what happened instead was one of the largest police operations in modern Japanese history. By May, law enforcement, supported by the Japan Ground Self-Defense Forces, had raided the cult's Tokyo headquarters. Leader Asahara himself, he was found on May 16th hiding inside a wall within a building known as the 6th Seition. Crazy stuff. In total, more than 200 arrests were made in connection with the attack, the final one coming 17 years later in 2012. But the severity of the Tokyo subway sarin attack is genuinely difficult to overstate. Even 3 decades on, it remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in Japan's post-war history and fundamentally altered the country's sense of its own safety and stability. All at a time when times were tough for the Japanese as is. As for Omu Shinrikyo, Asahara was sentenced to death in 2004 and executed in 2018, but the organization still exists today, rebranded as Aleph, with around 2,100 members left. The cult, by the way, apparently started as a yoga class, so be very careful who you practice your downward-facing dog poses with.
コマーシャルタイムです。
UFO ガール焼きそばに
港のガサ
これ私待ってましたやすこ。エクスは焼きそばにいろらよ。ピコスはリバーシブル寝袋よ。食べる送る当たるゴーゴー焼きそばにプレゼント。わお。
April brought bad news disguised as good news. Because that month, the Japanese yen hit what was then an all-time peak value of 79.75 to the US dollar. And while a strong currency sounds like a cause for celebration on the surface, there are two very distinct sides to this particular coin. No pun intended. Starting with the positives, individual Japanese consumers got a genuine, if temporary, boost. Trips to Guam and Japan's perennial holiday favorite Hawaii were now really cheap. Saw a big surge that summer, while imported goods became extraordinarily affordable. Discount retail chains and budget import stores, Uniqlo very much among them, were having the time of their lives. But then came the other side of the equation: de-industrialization. A yen this strong made producing anything inside Japan wildly expensive by international standards, and so giants like Toyota, Sony, Panasonic began shutting down domestic factories and relocating production to places like Southeast Asia, where costs were now a fraction of what they were at home. Meanwhile, the affordability of imports forced Japanese domestic suppliers to slash their own prices just to stay competitive, setting off a chain reaction that rippled through the entire economy. In short, the yen's historic peak was, on balance, a net negative for Japan, but a deceptively good-looking headline for anyone without a finance degree. You know, like me, who thought, great, let's include this as something uplifting for 1995. Boy, was I wrong. But at the very least, Japan's chronically overworked population got themselves an affordable, nice little trip to Waikiki out of it. They absolutely earned it. Someone else who'd earned himself a nice little break, Toriyama Akira. Starting on May 23rd, he finally got one. Because that day, Weekly Shonen Jump issue number 25 of 1995 included the 519th and final chapter of his long-running world-conquering manga series. I am, of course, talking about the legendary, the iconic, the genuinely unprecedented global cultural phenomenon known as Dragon Ball. Now, I already covered Dragon Ball's debut back in the 1984 episode, so I'll spare you the full origin story. But in the 11 years between that debut and this farewell, quite a lot had happened. When Dragon Ball's first chapter appeared in Weekly Shonen Jump, the magazine had a circulation of just under 4 million copies. Not bad at all, but by the time Son Goku said his final goodbye, that number was approaching 7 million. A growth driven in no small part by Dragon Ball itself, alongside a few other very prolific works published in the magazine. But as Shonen Jump magazine grew and changed, Dragon Ball itself evolved dramatically over its run as well. What started as a comedy that happened to feature fighting gradually turned into a story about fighting that occasionally featured comedy. And it worked magnificently. Dragon Ball didn't just survive that tonal shift, it became a timeless classic because of it. Currently sits at number 5 on the list of best-selling manga of all time, remarkable in itself, but even more so when you consider it achieved that with somewhere between a quarter and half the volume count of the 4 series ranked above it. But after 11.5 grueling years of working on the series, Toriyama finally eased off the throttle. Post-Dragon Ball, he continued drawing, mostly short stories and one-shots, before returning to the Dragon Ball universe in 2012. All of it, by the way, drawn with the same pen holder he'd been using since the age of 14. Now that pen holder has seen some things. Japan's next major obsession then made its debut in July, specifically on the 25th, when a machine called Purikura appeared for the first time in amusement parks across the country for the very first time. Before going on to conquer seemingly every corner of Japan forever. What exactly is a Purikura? Well, the word itself is short for print club. which admittedly still doesn't fully explain it. So just think of one of those instant photo booths that every one of us had to use at some point in our lives, but considerably more fun and considerably more Japanese. Rather than producing a single stiff headshot for a chop application, Purikura lets you squeeze in with your friends, strike a pose, then customize the result. Pick an adorable frame, add decorations, print as many sticker copies as you like for just 300 yen a pop, and trade them with friends, classmates, or anyone else willing to swap. The concept was of course an immediate massive hit, particularly with young girls, with more than 20,000 machines sold within just the first 2 years. Purikura spread from hotspots like Shibuya into what felt like every nook and cranny of Japan, becoming a full-blown national obsession among students, and a staple of the emerging gyaru schoolgirl subculture in particular. Turning photos into something playful, collectible, and social was an absolute masterstroke of an idea. And when you find out who invented it, things start to make even more sense. The Purikura was the brainchild of Atlus. Yes, that Atlus of Shin Megami Tensei and Persona fame. In fact, none other than Jack Frost, one of the longest-serving and most recognizable characters in both franchises, served as the in-machine guide explaining how to use it. Now that's frosty, and the machines evolved rapidly from there. Companies like Towa Japan caught on with the hype and introduced innovations such as full-body shots. Add modern features like face filters and digital decorations into the mix, and what you've got is something that has not only stood the test of time, but remains a fixture of Japanese pop culture and social media well into the 2020s. It all started, however, in July of 1995 with Jack Frost and a 300 yen roll of stickers. Because before anyone else figured it out, Atlus understood something fundamental. Kawaii is life, and extremely profitable if you know how to sell it. But the mood shifted completely 5 days later on July 30th, when a chilling crime unfolded in Hachioji City, Tokyo. Just after 10 PM that evening, a man and a woman entered Nanpei's supermarket, only to find 3 employees lying on the floor, shot dead. They alerted officers at a nearby police box, and an investigation began immediately. An investigation that is still open today more than 30 years later, without even a single arrest made. That evening, someone entered that supermarket around 9:15 PM, took 3 lives, and then simply vanished. Police initially investigated it as a robbery. The store had a reputation for lax security and had previously been targeted many times. But the fact that no money or valuables were taken quickly pointed toward a different motive entirely, possibly revenge. But beyond that, the motive has never been conclusively established. What makes this case even more haunting is the evidence that does exist. Witness descriptions, footprints, the type of weapon used, even fingerprints believed to belong to the killer. Yet, no arrests, no definitive suspect, no resolution. Over the decades, various theories have circulated, from a detained Yakuza member claiming that the perpetrator was a former self-defense forces officer, to a man in his 70s with a history of robberies. But nothing ever held. The case is still being investigated, though it grows more hopeless with every passing year. It stands out for more than its brutality and its lack of answers. The Hachioji supermarket murders are also considered a turning point for gun crime in Japan, a country where firearms violence is usually unheard of outside of organized crime. One can only wonder if this one will ever be solved. But from witnessing tragedy to remembering one, August 1995 was a month of reflection, as Hiroshima and Nagasaki both marked 50 years since the first, and so far only, use of atomic weapons in wartime. The 50th anniversary of the bombings was above all a time to mourn the victims and remember the horrors of humanity's darkest hour, but it was also, quietly, a celebration of 5 decades of survival, of 2 cities that had been erased from the map, but rebuilt themselves not just to their former glory, but beyond it. On August the 6th, crowds gathered at Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park for a ceremony of historic weight, as Mayor Hiraoka delivered a landmark peace declaration that was notable for going much further than most, acknowledging Japan's own wartime aggression across Asia while simultaneously appealing to the world for the complete abolition of nuclear weapons, And that same year also saw the launch of a new tradition, the Children's Peace Assembly, bringing together young people from across the globe to deliver a collective pledge to carry these memories forward into future generations. Then on August 15th, the 50th anniversary of Emperor Hirohito's historic surrender broadcast, Prime Minister Murayama Tomiichi issued what became one of the most significant formal apologies in post-war Japanese political history, expressing deep remorse for Japan's wartime conduct. So, August of 1995 wasn't simply about looking back at 1945. It was about what 50 years of resilience, reflection, and reconstruction actually meant, and about cementing a promise that the next 50 would be different.
Commercial time です。
ゼラード元気元気ゼラード元気元気ゼラード元気で頑張ろうゼラード元気よしゼラード元気
ムイラフアマと12種類の生薬ビタミンタウリン配合
ゼラード元気頑張ろうゼラード元気
頑張ろう
ゼラード元気で頑張ろう日本の元気
ゼナ大正製薬から
February may have belonged to hip-hop, but October was the arrival of Japan's next great pop icon. On the 16th, Amuro Namie released her debut album Dance Tracks Volume 1, and while calling it a debut album is, as we'll get to, somewhat debatable, what isn't debatable is that it marked the beginning of something very, very special. Amuro had never planned on becoming a singer actually. But scouted at the age of 12, she was then placed into idol group Super Monkeys in 1991, a group that was later renamed Namie Amuro with Super Monkeys, which tells you everything you need to know about how quickly it became clear she was the one to watch. Her presence in music and on Japanese television grew steadily. By 1995, the next logical step was obvious: go solo. So she did. Results launched her into an entirely different stratosphere of stardom. Dance Tracks Volume 1 is, in the most charming way possible, a bit of a strange release. It's less a debut album in the traditional sense and more of a remix record, built almost entirely from material originally recorded with the Super Monkeys, specifically from the sound the group had found just before their breakup: Eurobeat. The result is an album that sounds like someone took the soundtrack of a certain as-of-then unreleased 1998 drifting anime, threw it into a blender with 90s Japanese idol pop, and then turned it all the way up to 100. Nothing but bangers from front to back, and it sold. Dance Tracks Volume 1 debuted at number 1 on the Oricon album charts with close to 500,000 copies sold in its first week, eventually accumulating nearly 2 million in lifetime sales, which also makes it the 88th best-selling Japanese album of all time. All that, and it's not even officially considered part of Amuro's catalog. Because just 9 days later, on October 25th, she dropped her first proper solo single, Body Feels Exit, followed in December by Chase the Chance, her first number 1. Both of those tracks, along with her official debut album and 3 subsequent records, were all produced by Komuro Tetsuya, who steered Amuro's sound away from Eurobeat and toward a more polished dance pop direction. It was exactly the right call. Amuro Namie went on to become one of the defining pop artists of her entire generation in Japan. Her first 4 albums were all multi-million sellers, and the best-selling single ever released by a female Japanese solo artist, 1997's Can You Celebrate, also belongs to her. Can't really argue with those numbers, can you? But Amuro's influence went well beyond the music. With her predominantly Okinawan heritage and famously a touch of Italian ancestry, she became someone millions of Japanese girls and young women in the mid to late 90s aspired to look like. An iconic music career and a cultural footprint that stretched far beyond any chart position, that is Amuro Namie. And it all began with a weird, Eurobeat sort of debut album that wasn't really a debut album in October of 1995.
人形使いってあの正体不明のハッカーが警察だ。
我の時は語ることもわらべのごとく、思うこともわらべのごとく、論ずることもわらべのごとくなりしが、人となりてはわらべのことを捨てたり。
And now, for arguably the nerdiest thing to happen in Japan that entire decade. People standing in lines for an operating system. When I say lines, I mean lines, in the biggest, boldest capital letters I've got. On November 23rd, Microsoft launched Windows 95 in Japan, and Tokyo's legendary tech district proceeded to completely lose its mind. Now, under normal circumstances, the Japanese launch of an American product probably wouldn't make the cut for a series that is, after all, called Timeline Japan. But that Windows 95 launch in Akihabara, Tokyo has become kind of a legendary event, and rightfully so. Microsoft's revolutionary operating system had already rolled out in other countries a few months earlier, but now it was Japan's turn to get cozy with the taskbar, the start menu, and all that good stuff. The advertising blitz leading up to launch day in Japan was absolutely inescapable. Television commercials ran on a loop, hype was at an almost absurd level. Japanese computer enthusiasts were not about to wait until a reasonable hour of the morning to get their hands on some Windows Q2 Go. Waiting until dawn? Pathetically casual. Buying it the moment it became available at midnight? Now that's commitment. And Akihabara obliged with a midnight launch of divine proportions. An estimated 20,000 people turned up that night, each ready to hand over the roughly 13,000 yen for the world's new favorite operating system. Which may well make it the single best attended Windows 95 launch anywhere on Earth. As for the actual impact of Windows 95 on the Japanese PC market, enormous, just as it was everywhere else, but with one particularly significant local dimension. Japan had largely been running its own domestic PC operating systems for years, systems that had quietly kept things fragmented and non-standard in ways the rest of the world had already moved past. So, Windows 95 didn't just bring new features to Japan, it effectively ended those domestic operating systems entirely, finally standardizing PC architecture across the country in one fell swoop. A seismic shift for Japanese computing, and perhaps most impressively of all, it managed to do it without jamming even a single AI feature down anyone's throat. Crazy how that works, huh, Microsoft? To close out the dead center of the Japanese 1990s in the most fitting way possible, the launch of a brand new tradition that has continued every single year since. On December 12, 1995, the Japan Kanji Aptitude Testing Association announced the very first annual Kanji of the Year. What is the Kanji of the Year? Well, if you know what a kanji is, it's pretty self-explanatory, I guess. But for the uninitiated, Chinese characters used in Japanese writing, and the single biggest gatekeeper to actually learning the language. Each December 12th since 1995, the association selects one character from the thousands available. The one that, in their judgment, best captures the spirit and the mood of the year that just passed. For that inaugural selection in 1995, the chosen character was Shin, meaning quake. If you've been paying attention throughout this episode, you'll understand immediately why this one was a no-brainer. The great Hanshin earthquake that tore open the year was the most literal interpretation, but Shin carries a broader meaning too, one that resonates with everything else 1995 brought. The sense of a nation shaken, rattled to its foundations by economic anxiety, by the Tokyo subway sarin attack, and by many other events that made 1995 perhaps the gloomiest year in Japan of the decade so far. And that is how we leave 1995. Having experienced very high highs and extremely low lows. How will 1996 turn out? Well, I guess you're just gonna have to stick around to find out, just like these incredible Patreon supporters listed right here, including The Hockey Gentleman, Sachsenfuchs, D-Fox, Saikajo, Khalid Lebda, Xowiabu, Tricoat, Kevin Hickson, Buns, Journeyman351, RK0, Michael Smith, Hajimeno James, Utku Hussein Kaya, Steve Matsui, Hai Painen, Javier Soravia, Midnight Channel, Turam, Maruinu, Boo Boo Cakes, Chris Scott, Mickey Cox, Michael Wagner, CJ and Mary, Cats and Soup, Chart B-Man, Ben Harradine, White Gilden, Sierra DC, T-Bird, Metal Mama, Ian Farmer, Chris Wallace, JR Horse, Adea Kono, Guillaume Clement y Garcia, Ilya Kuznirovic, Jay-Z, Quintet, Microhex, Jules Schönefuß, Tarmanel, Kita Kitsune Northern Fox, Joe Peacock, and Anthony Newell. To you and to everyone else who stuck around for 1995. Thanks for watching, and I guess I will see you next year. じゃあまたね.
Aren't you about ready to go home now?